Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States, episode 4.47, Saratoga. 1777 was not going exactly like what John Burgoyne might have expected. Just a few months before, he had set off with a large army, issuing those triumphant proclamations that showed off his own flair for the dramatic, while simultaneously enraging the colonists. Things had gotten off to a good start for the general as well, as he managed to easily overrun the Americans at Ticonderoga, who had completely failed to garrison a critical hill. However, after he, quite literally, sent the Americans running from Ticonderoga, things had become a bit more difficult. The British supply lines were dangerously long, and real concerns over a food shortage had begun to settle in. Making matters worse, his attempts to resupply himself had failed after the Americans had defeated not one, but two foraging parties. Off to the east, reinforcements that were on the way to Burgoyne had fallen victim to a ruse put on by Benedict Arnold that saw the British under Barrymore St. Leger retreating back up into Canada. This is to say nothing of Lord Howe, who Burgoyne had hoped would link up with him in Albany. As we know from our last episode, though, Howe had no intention of traveling to Albany. He was actively engaging in battle with George Washington, first at Brandywine Creek, and then shortly thereafter in Germantown. Howe's objective for 1777 was Philadelphia, and he had no energy nor intention to take that trip north to New York. When we last left Burgoyne in episode 4.45, it was September 19th, and he was getting ready to attack the American position at Bemis Heights. Horatio Gates, now in control of the American war effort for the Northern Department, wanted a defensive battle with the British. Those same hard-learned lessons from battles like Bunker Hill had informed Gates that, rather than going on the offensive, it was better to put the Americans into defensible positions and allow the British to come to him. If the American Revolution had become a war of posts, with the Americans attempting to make every hill into a Bunker Hill, it was a prospect that Gates fully bought into. The Americans likewise had not just been sitting around for the last month twiddling their thumbs. They had established a position which they felt confident would give them the best chance at stymieing the British advance. Or, failing that, to make the cost of such an advance prohibitively expensive. If the British wanted to take the American position in Bemis Heights, Gates was set on ensuring that such a victory would be Pyrrhic. To that end, the Americans had chosen their position along Bemis Heights precisely because it was so defensible. Through these heights, the Hudson was flanked with high cliffs, ranging from 200 to 300 feet above the waterline. The ground around this channel was difficult to traverse and thick with foliage. If the Americans could properly protect the heights, they could threaten to push the British into a narrow channel, where the Continental Army, behind their defensive works, could easily attack the exposed enemy. The Americans had likewise done a good job of blocking roads and destroying bridges to help ensure that the British were going to have to come through their position. The Continental Army's advantage over the terrain really cannot be overstated here. To the north of Bemis Heights, where Gates was located, the British would have to deal with a large natural ravine, known as the Great Ravine. On both sides of this ravine, the Americans had set up redoubts and artillery to make the British advance that much more difficult. Not to mention the fact that the American army had quickly been growing, so that by the time the 19th rolled around, the Americans held a slight numerical advantage. Burgoyne was in a tough place here. He was running low on supplies. He was fighting with limited intelligence of the American positions, and really just needed to get to Albany as quickly as possible. He did not have the time to wait and come up with something better, and viewed his best option as being a frontal assault on the American position. This seemed to be reinforced from the fact that Burgoyne came across the American position on September 18th, and just a day later was pushing forward towards it. Military historian Kevin Weddell asserts that Burgoyne's main objective may have been to pin Gates down in his current position, while the column moved around to the west to outflank the Americans. If Burgoyne could accomplish this, the Americans would have to fall back and thus would lose the advantage that they held with such favorable terrain. Beginning the advance at around 9 a.m., after being delayed by fog, Burgoyne marched into battle with 3 columns. At the front was a mixture of Indians, Loyalists, and Canadians, acting as the advance scouts. The right was under the command of Simon Fraser, who had about 3,000 men. They were going to march along an area known as the Great Ravine, with the mission being to secure the high ground to the west of Bemis Heights. On the left along the Hudson was Baron Riedesel, and the German troops numbering around 1,600, plus another 600 or so in the rear. This group's objective was going to be holding Gates in position and opening up the Albany Road. Finally, it was James Hamilton, accompanied by Burgoyne, who would drive the center column with around 1,700 men in tow. The center was to provide the main thrust. Burgoyne had arranged his army in such a way that should any one column find itself overwhelmed or alternatively having some unexpected success, the other columns could easily shift over to their position. This way, any of the columns should have been able to support any of the other columns. Had everything gone well for Burgoyne, they would have seen that column on the left take the high ground along the west of the American position. Once they would have gained the high ground, it would have pushed the entire American army to the east, where they would have become jammed up against the river. The column along the river, that one that was made up of the Germans, would hold the Americans in that position, while the center column swooped in and made easy work of the pinned Americans. At around 10 a.m., the center column fired their cannon, marking the beginning of the battle and telling everybody that it was time to move. Initially, this all goes well for the British. There was minimal resistance by the Americans, as Gates was hesitant to run out and meet them, preferring instead to allow the British to come to him. The British center column was easily able to move across the potentially treacherous area that was the Great Ravine, and was able to cross a bridge to reach a location called Freeman Farm by around noon. Now, the British were making excellent time at this point, and that is largely because Gates had chosen not to head out and meet the British head-on, meaning that the column crossing through the Great Ravine did so without any opposition. This may well have been a squandered opportunity for the Americans, as the British would have been extremely exposed as they moved through the ravine. Although the center was able to move quickly, the left and the right columns found their journey to be a bit more arduous, as they had longer distances to travel through more challenging terrain. Not everybody, however, was totally on board with the wait-and-see approach by Gates. Benedict Arnold was nearly apoplectic at Gates for his decision not to move immediately against the British. Mostly in charge of the American left, as the actual command structure was a bit convoluted. Arnold was well aware of how exposed Burgoyne had been crossing the Great Ravine, and was eager to make him pay for it. Arnold, being his consistently persistent self, finally did convince Gates to let him send out Henry Dearborn and Daniel Morgan to probe the British column. Unlike what we had previously seen with Arnold, he was not taking on the job here of leading the troops personally from the front, but rather was remaining in the rear to help coordinate their movement. A pretty big change for him compared to, say, his action in Quebec the previous year. By noon, everybody was in place for the British. With everybody now being mostly ready, James Hamilton sent out around 100 men to do some scouting. Morgan and Dearborn made contact with this group at around 12:45, launching what would be hours of often brutal fighting. During this first encounter, the Americans would quickly gain the upper hand, as they inflicted heavy losses on the British scouting party, that quickly found itself being forced back. During the British retreat, the rest of Hamilton's troops were surprised, as they saw the men fleeing back towards them, and then opened fire on their own troops. I bring this up because during our last episode, we talked about a friendly fire incident for the Americans in Germantown. Clearly, the Americans did not hold a monopoly on such mistakes. Now, I had mentioned earlier that one of the key parts of Burgoyne's plan is that he had the columns all able to support each other, should something go either good or bad. The Americans would learn this the hard way, when Morgan chose to press his advantage. Fraser over on the right was quickly able to move over and support the retreating center, now unexpectedly exposing Morgan. Now quickly it was Daniel Morgan himself who had to order a retreat. The battle itself became an hours-long back-and-forth slog between both sides. The Battle of Freeman Farms featured both sides advancing, being forced back, and then repeating the entire thing over again. Much of the focal point of this battle would come over a couple of British guns, which would change hands multiple times during the fighting. The Americans would seize the guns from the British would counterattack and recapture their guns, and then everybody would do it again. The Battle of Freeman Farms was a bloody affair for both sides. I'm not going to spend huge amounts of time during this episode going into detail about the specifics of the battle itself. Oftentimes I do just that, because in those specific instances we learn a great deal about the American Army. Freeman Farm, however, was something different than what we have really seen thus far. Throughout the entire course of the day, there was very little movement by either side. The back-and-forth nature of the fighting mostly held everybody pretty much static. No huge gains were made for either the Americans or the British in terms of land. When the fighting ended at around 6:30 that evening, the true scope of what had happened really began to come into context. During the course of the day, the Americans had suffered 425 casualties, with 100 of those being men killed in the fighting. Another 40 Americans were listed as missing, though they had likely become prisoners of war. Over on the British side, they had suffered nearly 600 casualties. The fighting during the day on the 19th had, in so many ways, been the exact kind of war that the Americans wanted. The British had suffered heavy losses along their left, where Riedesel learned the hard way that the American fortifications on Bemis Heights were virtually impregnable. Much like what had happened on Breed's Hill, the British were subjected to an American force that, when fighting behind cover, proved to be lethal. As Kevin Waddell states, the fighting late in the afternoon of September 19th was amongst the most intense of the entire war. The Americans had very nearly smashed Burgoyne's army during the later stages of the battle. It was only Riedesel's limping in with grape shot that forced the Americans to retreat as nighttime fell. Technically, with the Americans retreating after being hit with Riedesel's cannons, it meant that the British held the objective, and it was the Americans who fell back. In the technical sense of the term, therefore, the Battle of Freeman Farms was a British victory. They had captured the field, and the Americans had to retreat. However, if the goal of the Americans was to ensure that, should they lose the battle, the British were forced to accept a Pyrrhic victory, it is very hard to argue with the results of September 19th. John Burgoyne had advanced 1 mile that day. The cost of moving forward that 1 mile was over 10% of his army. The British had lost double what the Americans had. The difference, however, was that the British losses could not be easily replaced. St. Leger was back in Canada. Howe was down south trying to capture Philadelphia. There was some hope that Henry Clinton might provide some reinforcements. However, as we are going to see in a few minutes, Burgoyne is going to soon see his last lifeline cut off. The Americans, on the other hand, had just, in all but name, won a huge victory. And as would prove to be the case, few things were better for recruiting than winning. Nobody exactly knew when the fighting was going to resume. The two armies were camped just a mile from each other. Small skirmishes and sniper attacks became a common occurrence. For everybody along the front, nobody knew when the fighting was going to pick right back up. Clearly, the Battle of Freeman Farms had not settled the issue. The British had gained an expensive mile, but pragmatically they were in the same position that they had been when they started the day. The Americans had learned from a deserter that the British were planning on attacking the American left on the 20th. However, after a very tense night with little sleep, Burgoyne was forced to give in to the need to rest his men. As the British were trying to figure out their next move, the Americans were dealing with internal turmoil. Following the battle, Horatio Gates had downplayed Arnold's role in the battle. Arnold had, yet again, been seen as a hero of the battle, having been a major asset in coordination between the lines. Arnold had, vocally, demanded a more aggressive approach, an approach that many felt would have outright defeated the British Army. In this manner, among the troops, Arnold found himself celebrated, whereas Gates, though feeling good about his position, found himself getting unwanted criticism for not being more aggressive. Gates would go ahead and make things worse on September 22nd, when he removed Morgan and Dearborn from Arnold's command, instead ordering Morgan to report directly to him. Further pouring gasoline on a now burning fire was that in his official letter to Congress, Gates failed to mention anything at all about Benedict Arnold. When Arnold voiced his dissatisfaction at this, Gates completely rebuffed him, letting him know that, technically, he did not even have a command. He was just filling in, and as soon as Benjamin Lincoln arrived, Arnold's command would be his. Gates went even further and downplayed any significance that Arnold had played in the battle, essentially labeling him as being useless. What ensued between the two men was a war of words. Written words because the two could not stand to be in the same room as each other. Gates, completely sick of Arnold, granted him permission to leave the army. When Arnold received this permission from Gates, again in writing, he completely ignored it. As October arrived, there were attempts by both Arnold and Gates to restore the peace between them. However, these were just as commonly rebuffed. Arnold informed Gates that he would not be leaving the army, and that instead he would remain to give whatever service and advice that he could to help with the coming battle. Arnold took care in the wording of the letter to make abundantly clear to anybody who might be looking at it that he was staying to assist in the service of his country. Although this would put to rest the active phase of their fighting, I bring it up because we all know what will come in Arnold's future. While Gates and Arnold feuded, Burgoyne was sitting in a very tough spot. Although he tried to draw a happy picture and was certainly claiming the victory, Pyrrhic or not, Burgoyne was in a desperate state. He had paid dearly for his minimal gains on the 19th, and all of those problems that he had before the battle still existed. On September 21st, Burgoyne received some much-needed news. He was going to get those desperately needed reinforcements. Henry Clinton had written back on September 11th that he was en route. Clinton had planned to attack the forts along the lower Hudson, forcing the Americans to pull men off the front with Burgoyne and race out to stop a surging Clinton. Clinton never really planned to link up with Burgoyne. However, by reducing the American force, it would have the same effect. Burgoyne would be able to smash through, and, albeit with considerably more difficulty than he anticipated, limp his way into Albany. This move by Clinton would, essentially, substitute for the role that Burgoyne had envisioned for Howe. Although he had some 7,000 troops under his command, Clinton moved very slowly from New York City. He did successfully capture 2 forts along the way. However, Clinton would make it no closer. By the time that Clinton had seized the 2 forts, Burgoyne was acknowledging his desperate state. With his Indian allies having melted away, his rear was dangerously exposed. American sharpshooters had been harassing him ever since the 19th. His food supply was dwindling while the American numbers were rapidly growing, as men became anxious to get in on the victory. For the very first time, Burgoyne began to acknowledge that retreating back into Canada may become a necessity. So the question becomes, why did Clinton stop his progress towards Albany? Although he was not originally planning to link up with Burgoyne, his mission was always meant to be a diversion to draw men away from Burgoyne. He was, by all measures, having success as he proceeded up the Hudson. By the fall, Albany was in reach, and a rendezvous with Burgoyne suddenly seemed to be in the cards. He had managed to capture 2 forts, and the Americans seemed unable to stop him. This is to say nothing of the fact that he held a significant number of men under his command. There were problems, however. First, communication and therefore coordination between Clinton and Burgoyne were always difficult. Remember that the Americans were positioned in between the two armies. And while that is not generally a great place to be, it did mean that communications between the two British generals was ripe for interception by the Americans. Which is exactly what happened. While Clinton was busy celebrating his own successes, he worried that Burgoyne may well have run out of time. Writing in the middle of October, Clinton boasted of his own victories, while writing that he was not sure the status of Burgoyne and worried that he may have retreated to the north. Although communication problems were of real concern, the major and ultimately fatal blow to Clinton's expedition came in the middle of October, some 40 miles south of Albany. The local pilots who had been guiding the British through the Hudson refused to go any further, and militia activity in the area made an overland trek too dangerous. With the British, now at least temporarily delayed, the news came from the south that would officially end Burgoyne's hopes at being relieved. Following the near disaster at Germantown, General Howe was feeling a bit vulnerable. He was determined to hold on to Philadelphia. He had fought hard to capture it. Howe needed reinforcements and wrote to Clinton that he needed an extra 4,000 troops to hold Philadelphia. Howe was Clinton's commanding officer, so despite those successes, Clinton was in no real position to hold back his men. Annoyed and fully believing that Howe was making a colossal mistake, Clinton gave way and sent the reinforcements. This unfortunately meant that he now lacked the manpower to do anything else. Despite all of his success through the Hudson River Valley, he was going to fall short of reaching Albany, or Burgoyne to save the day. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne was going to be on his own. Camp existence had been a miserable experience for the British since the end of the battle on the 19th. The Americans never stopped harassing the British and had spent the last several weeks constantly taking shots wherever they could. The problems that Burgoyne had before the battle on the 19th still existed, and now were just that much worse. By early October, the animals were in serious danger of starving to death. The exhausted and rattled men saw their food supply dipping dangerously low, as Burgoyne had to cut rations. Men were miserable and were deserting in droves. At the same time as his army was falling apart, Burgoyne was painfully aware that the American army was growing. Sure, Burgoyne was promising that help was on the way. However, it was lost on nobody that time was not on their side. So the question therefore is, what was Burgoyne going to do? He had little information about where Clinton was. However, if the plan had been for Clinton to strip away men from Gates, well, he knew that the army under Gates was rapidly growing. By early October, Burgoyne had accepted the fact that he had to do something. Otherwise, the animals were going to starve to death. Burgoyne made clear that he did not want to fall back. Albany was, after all, in front of them. This meant that really, there were very few options left on the table. With catastrophe looming over his army, Burgoyne settled on a large reconnaissance mission that was set to take place on October 7th. If Burgoyne liked what he saw, they would attack on the 8th. Otherwise, he would swallow his pride and retreat back to the north. Critically, Burgoyne did not intend for anything more than a reconnaissance mission to happen on October 7th. This was not some feint that he intended to parlay into an attack. He really did want to head out with the army, take a look around, gauge the American defenses, and then come back the next day to do the actual fighting. What Burgoyne wanted was to get a good idea of what they were looking at. Reconnaissance or not, Burgoyne was aware that there was an inherent danger with any mission of this nature. This helps to explain why he marched out with such a large force on the 7th. The British had been working on securing their position in the weeks following that first battle. They had built a series of redoubts that would, hopefully, help solidify their position. The biggest of these three, the Great Redoubt, was located on the east side of the Great Ravine, giving the British a vantage point of both the ravine and the Hudson River. About a mile further to the west, on the other side of the Great Ravine, was Bremen's Redoubt. This was located where the heaviest fighting had occurred a few weeks earlier during that first battle. A third redoubt was constructed nearby Bremen's, known as Balcarres Redoubt. This redoubt was unique because it was oriented to the west. With the British marching out in force for their mission on October 7th, they did so in 3 columns. Simon Fraser took a lead position that morning, although it should be noted that Burgoyne was along for the march. Fraser would move out in the front with a group of scouts and a handful of remaining Indians, while ensuring that the British right flank was safe. Although the British were not expecting a fight, nor were they looking for one, they still took precautions in case one broke out, including dragging along the artillery. On the left, there was a column of British grenadiers, under the command of Major Ackland. The center fell under the command of Redesel. The initial march was difficult. The Americans had done significant damage to the roads and the bridges, and the march through the overgrowth was not exactly a pleasure walk. After about half an hour, Burgoyne halted in a clearing. He ordered his men to fan out and create a temporary defensive line. Immediately, however, problems were apparent. The line that Burgoyne put in place was long, over 3/4 of a mile. Although a lot of the men had marched out on the mission, with such a long defensive line, it inevitably meant that the line became dangerously thin in places. Likewise, Burgoyne stopped right on top of the American position, which was now less than a 1/4 mile away. American sentries were quick to figure out that there was a large British force that was basically right on top of them. The Americans did skirmish with a handful of the most advanced British scouts, chasing them away. However, for Burgoyne, the damage was done. If he wanted to keep the mission a secret, well, that opportunity was now very much gone. Now, and this might seem like an odd decision, after getting the defensive line in place, Burgoyne actually stopped on the farm that he was occupying and had his men begin to gather wheat. The food shortage, being what it was, meant that the British desperately needed the extra provisions. This meant, however, that the British were in a position close to the American camp, a position that was vulnerable. A vulnerable position that the Americans were now very well aware of. Upon hearing what they were up to, Horatio Gates would quickly conclude that the British were preparing for battle. The next part of what happens is clouded in some confusion. Depending on the source, Benedict Arnold quickly sprang into action. I will admit that between all of the sources that I have used for this episode, nobody really seems to agree on what Arnold's role in all of this was, other than, in short order, he went out along with Morgan and Dearborn to see what the British were up to. Some sources state that he made his move unilaterally, in defiance of Gates. Other sources say that the two men had reconciled, and that Arnold was the de facto commander of the American left. Really, too, there is evidence that goes in both directions. Both Gates and Arnold had their supporters and their detractors. Plenty of people were quick to paint Arnold as being a hero, while Gates was overcome with indecisiveness. When those men would give their accounts of the battle, often years later, those prejudices and bad feelings would remain, and would color their accounts. Returning once more to historian Kevin Weddell, he points out that there is little evidence of an interpersonal battle between Arnold and Gates on October 7th, and that Arnold plainly appears to have been in command of the left. However, we should also not discount the fact that just days before the battle, Gates and Arnold were not on speaking terms. Surely it is not out of the question that on the 7th, bad feelings still remained between the two men. Gates had likewise all but removed Arnold from the command structure upon the arrival of Benjamin Lincoln, who was now indeed present. Historian and Arnold biographer James Kirby Martin insists that Arnold was acting on nobody's authority but his own. Martin stated that it had likely been Morgan who forced Gates into action and got permission to go check on the British lines. When Arnold appears, it is, somewhat unsurprisingly, Morgan that he is attempting to connect with. So, which one of these tellings is correct? Certainly, Arnold's heroics at Saratoga are legendary. However, as to the question of if he was operating within his orders, well, that seems to be more elusive. I am not a historian, and as such, I'm not going to attempt to explain what actually happened that day between Gates and Arnold. However, I do want you all to be aware that even between professional historians, there is a split between them on the matter. Regardless of to whom the orders were given, in short order, Gates did authorize Morgan and Dearborn, and maybe Benedict Arnold, to head out and see what all the fuss was about. Gates ordered General Enoch Poor to move against Burgoyne's left flank. Daniel Morgan would take a far longer trip around the British right flank. The British became aware of the American movements around 2:30 in the afternoon. Although the Americans did an admirable job of using the terrain for cover, eventually the British were able to figure out that they were not alone. Once the British became aware of the rapidly mounting American threat, they opened fire with their 12 and 6-pounders. The Battle of Bemis Heights was on. Despite the large guns for the British, the heavily forested area rendered the guns all but moot against Poor and his men, who just continued to assemble. Quickly, the British left found itself in serious trouble. Major Ackland only had 266 men along the front, who were now being overwhelmed. During the fighting, Ackland himself was seriously wounded and captured. Soon, those same 12-pounders that had moments earlier been firing on the Americans had also been captured by those same troops, who now quickly spun them around and began firing on their, now former, British owners. The fight for Poor was never really close. About half an hour after fighting began, the British left had completely collapsed. Over on the other side, Morgan and Dearborn were having similar luck. Morgan had outflanked the British and hit them along the rear right side of their line. It did not take much time before the right side of the British line began to give way from Morgan's attacks. Already by this point, the battle seems to have been over for Burgoyne. Both of his flanks were falling apart, with the left already having done so and the right now beginning to bend. It is unlikely that he would have been able to pull a victory out on this day. What Burgoyne needed was to retreat and live to fight another day. Reading the situation, Burgoyne did just that, dispatching Sir Francis Clark to tell General Phillips and Redesel to fall back. Now, you do not need to worry about remembering Clark's name, because unfortunately for the British, he was killed before he could deliver his message. Neither Phillips nor Redesel ever received these most important of orders. Horatio Gates is going to be the subject of both praise, and as we will discuss, some criticism over the battle. While so much of his reputation in this battle is tied to Benedict Arnold, it is hard to criticize Gates here for not recognizing the situation. Per Kevin Weddell, when Arnold told Gates that he believed he and his men could move further north and attack Fraser, Gates agreed. He saw how the battle was progressing and believed that he had an opportunity to inflict major damage to the British. Gates ordered Brigadier General Ebenezer Learned to march up the center and hit Redesel, while ordering Arnold to move further north with men from under Poor's command. Even before Gates sent Arnold with reinforcements towards the British left, or Learned against the center, Burgoyne was outnumbered. Now, however, it was an overwhelming numerical advantage. The Americans hit the British center and quickly it too began to be pushed back. During the fighting, General Simon Fraser, Burgoyne's second-in-command, was killed. Yet another devastating blow to Burgoyne's beleaguered mission. With the Americans now pouring on the pressure, the British lines quickly began to give way, resulting in the British retreat becoming even more disorderly. As the British fell back, the Americans did not stop and allow them to leave the field, and instead chose to continue pursuing them. Arnold and Poor decided that they had an opportunity to take those British redoubts that we had talked about a few moments ago. Arnold and Poor first attempted to take Balcarres Redoubt. This, however, was going to be much more difficult than Arnold had anticipated. You see, as the British had pulled back, many of them had congregated in that specific redoubt, as it was the closest to the fighting. making the capture of it that much more difficult. No worries, though. Quickly, Arnold figured out that while Balcarres Redoubt was going to be more difficult to capture, Bremen's Redoubt was now undermanned. Arnold, seeing his chance, moved between the two redoubts and put his forces on Bremen's Redoubt. Now, to be clear, while this sounds like an easy feat, it was anything but. Arnold was under very heavy fire as he and his men crashed through the thin German line, which was wedged between the two redoubts. Benedict Arnold, correctly, saw that if he could take Bremen's Redoubt, he could potentially turn the entire British right, which would have the effect of putting Burgoyne's entire army at risk for destruction. Morgan and Dearborn launched a frontal attack on the redoubt while Arnold and Learned's men poured through gaps in the walls. Arnold, who by this point had put on an impressive show, was preparing to ride his horse into the British camp when he and his horse were hit by a volley. Arnold was hit in the leg, the same leg that was hit 2 years before in Quebec. His horse was killed as well and fell on top of him, shattering the already injured leg. Even as he sat there, seriously injured, he would continue shouting orders to Morgan's men. The Germans would make a final attempt to retake the redoubt, but by this point night was falling and the battle was over. If the British had celebrated the First Battle of Freeman Farms as a victory, regardless of whether or not it was a Pyrrhic victory, there was nothing that Burgoyne could do to make this look better. The British had just taken a bad loss, with Burgoyne suffering nearly 900 casualties, including his own second-in-command. The Americans, in contrast, suffered around 200 casualties. The Americans did suffer a serious injury to Arnold, as well as Benjamin Lincoln, although both men would survive their wounds. Gentleman Johnny had left Canada some months earlier on a march to Albany that he fully believed was going to be glorious and filled with victory after victory. Now, however, even he had to acknowledge that it was over. He was not going to be reaching Albany in 1777. On October the 9th, Burgoyne would abandon his camp and begin his withdrawal, leaving the sick and wounded in his field hospitals behind. Although he did leave a note for Gates, asking him to please take care of the men. Burgoyne's beleaguered men truly were limping back to Canada. As it would turn out, they would not need to limp very far. 7 miles north of the battlefield, in Saratoga, Horatio Gates and the Americans managed to trap Burgoyne against the Hudson. Burgoyne now officially had no options left. He could not easily cross the river, as militia companies were now occupying the east bank of that river. Having caught up to him, Gates now had Burgoyne completely surrounded. There was nowhere for the British to go. They were badly outnumbered, desperately low on supplies, and there was nothing they could do about it. Simply put, they were trapped, and there was no way out. Burgoyne, finally fully accepting his situation, requested a parley to open negotiations with the Americans. On October 13th, Gates made his terms clear. He wanted an unconditional surrender. The proud Burgoyne refused. Worried about what Clinton was doing to his south and unaware of his current position, Gates agreed to what would become known as the Extraordinary Convention. On October 17th, Burgoyne surrendered. The Americans captured 5,728 men, agreeing with Burgoyne that they would all be put on ships and sent back to England. Except, when the Congress would find out about the terms of this surrender, they were not thrilled. Burgoyne and his men could easily turn right back around and be used against the Americans in the future, or alternatively, in future European conflicts relating to the war. Not to mention that prisoner of war exchanges throughout the Revolution were always fraught with difficulty. Part of the problem is that when the British troops returned home, they just turned around and came right back. Whereas the Americans who were held by the British were typically done fighting, if they got released. This means that even using Burgoyne's men in a prisoner exchange was to the advantage of the British. Therefore, despite the convention, Congress was not going to take the risk. Rather than being returned home, Burgoyne's army was to be held as prisoners of war. A debate can be had as to whether or not the American victory at Saratoga was in fact the biggest victory for them in the entire war. Sure, the war was not over. That would not come for several more years at Yorktown. However, the American victory would profoundly change the war moving forward. Next time, the victory at Saratoga is going to send shockwaves throughout both the colonies and Europe alike. When we return, we are going to spend our time looking at just how the war was changing as we head into 1778, as a new phase of the conflict was about to begin. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as we look at the aftermath of Saratoga.